Hello, everybody. Hi, and welcome. And it's a real pleasure to be here. Scott, thanks very much for having me once again. I got to realize, why am I always the only guy in a tie? Listen, let's just jump right in, shall we,
Sure.
Commissioner? Because you might have heard about this fight over 26 words that people say define the internet. Section 230, I'm not sure you're familiar with this. I have a feeling that a lot of our people watching are watching because of this. Can you give us exactly your idea on where we stand right now in this obviously massively important and contentious potential legal battle?
Sure. So obviously, the Department of Commerce, as you probably know, filed a petition with the FCC, and we announced last week that I intend to move forward with the rulemaking. And I gave a full statement, which of course is available on the internet. But in a nutshell, the General Counsel has advised that the FCC has the power to interpret the liability provision of Section 230. And the General Counsel published that legal opinion this week. And so everybody can see exactly what we're thinking in that regard.
You know, because there is that school of thought that it doesn't matter sort of what the FCC thinks, that you guys don't have the legal basis to even make the rules. Even some of your own commissioners have said, this is Congress's job, it's not your job. Obviously, you disagree. Is it contentious inside the FCC now?
Well, I can't speak to what my other colleagues might think. All I will simply say is that we are heeding the advice of the General Counsel, who has opined in a very detailed analysis, again, published just recently, that under Section 230 and Section 201B of the Communications Act, the FCC has a legal provision that it is empowered to opine on. And this is consistent with the Supreme Court's decisions in the AT&T versus Iowa Utility Board's case, as well as some other recent Supreme Court cases as well. So in terms of the legal foundation, I think it is fairly clear, based on the General Counsel's opinion, that the FCC does have the authority to interpret that liability provision.
Okay, so that said, there are two, like everything these days, you've got basically a lot of people on both really far ends of the spectrum that get a lot of attention. Probably most people are in the middle, but let me lay out both arguments, as you know, Mr. Commissioner, which is number one, if we don't do something, the internet is going to destroy us. If we do something too extreme, we will destroy the internet and ruin social media. Is there some way to do this without both sides being partly correct?
Well, I think what you're hinting to is a broader policy debate, which of course is something that the elected branches of Congress, as well as the executive branch, are considering. From our perspective, we're focused on the question about the proper interpretation of that liability provision. Obviously, there's a broader conversation out there in the halls of Congress and in the American public, but we're focused, as the General Counsel opined, on how do we interpret that liability provision properly.
And how do you?
That's exactly what we're going to be seeking to do. And so based on the opinion that under Section 201B, the Commission has the authority, that's one of the things that we'll be examining, is exactly how do we give meaning to some of those terms which some have said are ambiguous in the relevant part of Section 230.
And how hard is that to do?
That's exactly what we're going to figure out. So we are continuing to look at the record. We will continue to analyze the law, and in this case, as in all cases, we will make the right decision based on the facts and the law as we see them.
Is it your belief, just even as the FCC commissioner or personally, that indeed Twitter, Facebook, others are indeed publishers under the law?
Well, that's a different question from the one that we are looking at. We are focused, of course, on that liability provision, but I think that the immunity that is granted through that provision is something that has spurred a lot of discussion. And so that's part of the reason why we're focused on what is the scope of immunity under Section 230, and you're leaving that broader policy debate to others at this time.
Do you believe there is? I know right now, of course, it's being made a conservative issue, and people saying that the president's unhappy with Twitter, and so he wants you guys to do something about it. We had Joe Biden, and I think it was January, February, making comments that Section 230 also needed to be changed. I don't want to use the word scrapped. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but he also came out and said something needed to be done. Do you believe there is some kind of bipartisan support for a change that might make it more liable something does get done, even on the margins?
Based on the public reporting, there's no question that there is bipartisan support regarding changes. For example, members of Congress from both parties have suggested that reforms are appropriate to Section 230. As you mentioned, the executive branch has made its views known. The vice president has explicitly campaigned on repealing Section 230 altogether. And just last week, I mean, he's not an elected officer, but in terms of the interpretation of that immunity provision, Justice Thomas offered a statement in the Malwarebytes case suggesting that the interpretation of the immunity provision had gone beyond the text of Section 230. So I think there's a widespread view among all three branches of government that this is something that is worth examination.
Yeah, listen, this is going to be, Mr. Commissioner, as we all know, and a lot of the people that are probably tuning in right now know or will watch later, this is going to be a defining fight, maybe for generations to come. I mean, social media has kind of, come out of nowhere in the last decade and really does dominate our conversation in many ways. I described it to friends in some ways like this. I feel like it's 1925 and everybody's got a car, but we're kind of, running around crashing into each other. But, there will be laws and street signs and lamps and driver's license requirements down the road. How do you picture social media looking in 20 years, 10 years?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, I certainly don't have a crystal ball that would give me, with any precision, a prediction about how it will turn out. But I do think that social media is increasingly a factor in everybody's lives. A lot of people use these platforms, of course, and that's part of the reason why there's such a robust discussion these days on all sides of the issue. So how that policy debate plays out, I think, is something that Congress will look at. But again, from our perspective, we're focused on that proper interpretation of that immunity provision and making sure that based on the facts and the law, that we are making the right interpretation.
Yeah, listen, there's also hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars ultimately behind this. I mean, these are companies that have created a lot of wealth for their founders, for their shareholders, but they also do a lot of social good where people can connect with people. I know during the pandemic time, you might have heard about this pandemic, Mr. Commissioner, that, for me, I haven't seen my mom since Christmas. She's 81 years old, living in rural Virginia, not in the best of health. And so social media for us is kind of vital to be like, hey, Mom, how you doing? And making sure that there is connection. Your response during I think March 11th will probably go down as the day where everything sort of hit the fan, if you know what I'm saying. Take us into those first few days from your perspective, the FCC's response. What was it like?
It was fairly daunting, I will say, both as the the regulator of the communications sector, but also as the leader of our agency. It became quickly apparent in early March that hundreds of millions of Americans would be shifting to a work from home, stay at home environment. And so our top priority was making sure that American consumers could stay connected. And I will say, as the manager of our agency, it was very important to me to keep our staff safe. And so we were one of the first agencies to shift our staff en masse to a work from home environment and to set up the IT and other infrastructure needed for them to be able to do their jobs. And I'm glad we did that. So as to the first part of it, we initiated the Keep Americans Connected pledge in mid-March, a pledge that no consumer or small business would lose service as a result of the disruptions caused by the pandemic, that late fees or other associated charges would be waived for the duration of the pandemic, and that the Wi-Fi hotspots that a provider might have would be open to any consumer who might need them. And ultimately, almost 800 providers took that pledge, serving the vast majority of American citizens. And especially in those early days when everything seemed to be up in the air. How are we going to do our jobs? How are our kids going to learn? How are we going to see a healthcare provider remotely and safely? I think the broadband networks that we have stood the test of time. And so I'm very grateful to those providers for taking the pledge and for the widespread support for the regulatory reforms we've had over the last 3.5 years that enabled us to have very strong broadband networks that sustained that peak internet traffic that we saw in the spring.
Right, because you're trying to do two things at once. I mean, number one, you're trying to stay connected yourself. You and your team and everybody else in the FCC is just personally, all of a sudden the kids are home, you're home, everybody's trying to access the same Wi-Fi point, whatever it is. But at the same time, you realize that America now needs it more than ever. Like, people found out how good or bad their internet connection was very quickly in the early parts of March. What were some of the greatest hurdles that you guys had to face?
I think some of the greatest hurdles were simply just the vast array of things that needed to be done to ensure that our regulatory framework incentivized these communication services to stay up and running. And here I have to give the credit to the FCC's fantastic career staff. I mean, they really pulled out the stops, For example, relaxing some of the regulations in our Lifeline program to make sure that those who had just recently lost their jobs didn't have to produce 3 months of income documentation, only one. Same thing with respect to the E-rate program, relaxing the gift rules so that schools could solicit and providers could offer connectivity solutions that would enable people to do remote learning. On the telehealth side, standing up a COVID-19 telehealth program based on recently granted authority from Congress and getting $200 million committed to healthcare providers across the nation, from New York City to Navajo Nation, to enable healthcare providers to provide care remotely and safely to the patients who need it. I mean, they really stepped up to the plate, and those career staff are dedicated public servants who deserve our praise.
Did you have, and they certainly, listen, everybody out there from the staff doing that stuff to the folks working overnight shifts at, ShopRite, trying to stock the shelves so we all could get food, as that initial wave of just total fear, at least here in the Northeast, encompassed us all. What kind of rule streamlining? There's physical connectivity, right? But then there's also like, hey, we might need to change some policies here because everything is suddenly very different. Was there any of that going on behind the scenes?
Oh, definitely. So one great example of that is Spectrum, the wireless airwaves that people use to transmit and receive information. And especially in a pinch with the increase in traffic, what we did was to facilitate the transfer of Spectrum temporarily from to companies who really needed it, to either increase access or to provide access in the first place. And one good example is the so-called 5.9 gigahertz band. There are many providers who needed that temporary access to Spectrum to address the network increase and to provide access. And so one example is Amplex in Lucky, Ohio. Probably few people have heard of it, but they use this 5.9 gigahertz spectrum to give rural people access that they didn't have before. And that's just one example of many of the things we did on the regulatory side.
Yeah, because now all of a sudden the idea of rural access, urban access is back in focus, as you know, and I'm sure you've heard the critics. What they'll say is the claims that are made by the FCC and the government just are not true, that maybe one farmer in a mile can get internet. And so you say, well, that whole mile has internet, or one block, in Philadelphia will get it. And so everybody has it. How do you counter the critics that say the broadband access is not what it is claimed to be?
Well, a few different things on that point. First of all, by any metric you should use, the digital divide has closed over the last several years. Millions more Americans have access to the internet today than they had when I got into office. But secondly, this underscores the importance of the FCC's digital divide efforts. For example, just next week, we're starting the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund auction, a $20 billion auction broken up into 2 different phases that will target up to 10 million Americans who are on the wrong side of that divide. And against some short-sighted partisan opposition, we're moving ahead with that next week. And third, I would argue that some of the regulatory reforms that we've done over the last several years, when you put them all together, they deliver a stronger business case for deployment, especially for low-income urban areas or rural areas where that business case hasn't existed before. And I know it sounds arcane, easier and quicker, cheaper access to utility poles, or focusing companies' efforts on fiber as opposed to copper, getting rid of utility-style regulation of the internet. But these are the forward-thinking regulatory reforms we've done to enable that digital divide to close. It's more important than ever, I think.
What are the biggest problems? What have been some of the biggest hurdles? You make it sound so easy, but clearly it's not.
Absolutely. So one problem is, of course, that it's just challenging in a lot of places. And we have a sparsely populated country in many places, and just the business case is hard there. In other areas, there might be state and local regulations that stand in the way of streamlining that would enable these broadband networks to be constructed. Additionally, there have been a lot of regulatory roadblocks along the way that we've surmounted at every turn. For example, the wireless infrastructure reforms that we pursued were challenged in court. I'm grateful the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals rejected that challenge almost in toto. But those are the kinds of things we've had to overcome. And the results, though, speak for themselves. Our networks now have been strong enough over the last 7 months that, unlike Europe, we have not had to go to YouTube and Netflix and other streaming services and ask them to proactively throttle their content to get it reduced from HD to SD, as they've done in Europe, because we know that our broadband networks are stronger. We've had the infrastructure investment to sustain that increase in traffic. And that, I think, is one of the many signs of success. In addition to speeds doubling since 2017, small cells increasing, fiber deployment setting records in 2018 and 2019 and the like.
Do you think there's any chance that we ultimately will have to, as you said it, throttle those networks? My gosh, watching SD, not HD. How's our bandwidth right now?
I think the networks have done extremely well. And in fact, what is amazing is that over the last 6 months, or last 7 months, essentially from February until September, I believe it is, fixed and mobile broadband speeds in the United States increased, even though we had this increase in usage. So I think our networks have held up very well. And I do not think we should ever have to go to those providers and ask them to throttle content. Thanks to our forward-thinking regulatory reforms, many of which were opposed every step of the way, we've been able to enable infrastructure to scale in concert with the increase in usage.
And what's the end? Is there any forecast? Everyone's kind of trying to figure out where we're going to be in 6 to 9 months, right? In terms of, I never like the terms forever and never. I found that in studying a lot of history, those words tend to not frequently be accurate, right? And there's people like, well, never go back to the office, or we're going to work from home forever. I just don't see those things happening. I think at the end of the day, we all like and need human contact, and sitting out in Aspen and doing whatever and having a cocktail or a coffee, whatever it might be. Are there any estimates that you guys have done about broadband need and availability a year from now, 2 years from now? I mean, what are you projecting as far as this weird world that we're all currently in? I'm sitting in my office at home.
Certainly, there's there's a lot of uncertainty about what exactly the work environment is going to look like writ large. Sir, I've been at home, of course, for the last several months, and it sounds like you have as well. But my goal is for the FCC to enable anybody to be able to do their work from any location. If it happens to be in the office, great. We want there to be strong enterprise broadband networks that can support that. And similarly, if you're working at home and helping your kids do remote learning, as I am now, we want to make sure that your home broadband networks are very strong as well. So our goal is to not drive the market, of course, in any type of way in terms of the work environment, but simply to enable flexibility for people to make the choices that are right for them.
And speaking of that, listen, I have a friend of mine who is a principal at a middle school at a blue collar area of New Jersey. And, what he said is he's got about 30% of his kids who've just vanished. They're not remote learning. They're just gone. He doesn't, they don't have the resources to go to the homes, nor they feel it's sensible to knock on doors and say, where's your son? He hasn't logged into Zoom for a couple of days or weeks, and they're really suffering. Obviously, you've got families, that may have 3 or 4 kids. They're sharing one iPad or one Wi-Fi connection. What's the FDA's role and or responsibility, especially if we're in this world for another 6 months? Or by the way, we have another pandemic in a couple years or a couple decades. What's the FCC's role in making sure that everybody can connect?
We have a critical role, and I think that role has only been underscored by the pandemic. There's a great story in ProPublica about a boy named Shamar and the difficulties that he has had in Baltimore in terms of remote learning. And some of the technology is great, of course, it helps us connect, but in the remote learning environment, that can really be a challenge, especially for those who previously might not have had access or who didn't have the support infrastructure in place to take advantage of it. And so from our perspective, what we've done is to modernize the E-rate program in the midst of the pandemic, relaxing the gift rules, for example, which I discussed, making more money available through the different windows where schools and libraries can apply. Also, working with the Department of Education, we publicized $16 billion that Congress made available through the CARES Act for education technologies. And many governors and other entities from Oklahoma to Delaware to Alabama have now taken advantage of that to provide connected tools. In addition to that, we've had a lot of public-private partnerships. We've done a ton of outreach to education groups and other consumer advocates to help consumers be aware of some of the options that are out there. And obviously, there's still some challenges, but I think we have made progress. And in addition to all of that stuff I've described, which is education specific, our bread and butter work at the FCC, closing the digital divide, making a ton more spectrum available for Wi-Fi, making sure that wireless infrastructure is stronger, all of that helps support the remote learning tools that students and teachers need in this unfortunate time.
Yeah, I mean, listen, we want to be safe, but let's be clear. I mean, we talk about income and wealth inequality now. I mean, think about 5 and 10 years from now, the education gap that's grown because of this. It has to be something that's on the minds of everybody, which is that you're going to have millions of kindergartners and first graders who may not learn to read while millions of others do. I mean, there's got to be other considerations in this. Obviously, listen, I work for NBC Universal, CNBC, my parent company is obviously Comcast. And so they've got many horses in this fight. I'm not here as a representative of Comcast that work for CNBC, but my parent company is here. And listen, I know that from TV ads, they're just saying we're doing our part to help. And have the cable companies, have the internet providers, have they indeed stepped up? A lot of companies making a lot of big claims. Are they doing it?
This is one of the most impressive things I found during the Keep Americans Connected pledge discussions in the spring. When we issued that challenge, we not only asked the providers to take those three different parts of the pledge, but we urged them to go above and beyond. And one of the most amazing things is that these broadband providers, big and small, really did step up. For example, some of them offered free upgrades in terms of speed to consumers. Some offered low-income services, bespoke services to low-income consumers that didn't exist before. Many others worked with schools and hospitals and others for unique connectivity solutions. And I think it just shows at the end of the day, we really are all in this together. We're Americans first before anything else. And I think that sense of community is really important, especially in the communication space.
Now, listen, don't just say that because they're my parent company. I've had no communication with them. I don't even tell them I'm doing this panel except for CNBC. I mean, and so, I mean, have they stepped up on their own, or was it more the carrot, or was it more the stick?
Well, I think there are a variety of things. So number one, I think these people tend to live in their communities. They care about their communities. They want to do the right thing by their fellow citizen. Number two, there are also market forces here. I mean, if you don't step up for your consumers, your customers at a time of need, your customers are going to remember that. And I think that's part of it as well, that the market forces encourage them to do so. And number three, I mean, look, I'll be blunt. I mean, I think the fact that I challenged the industry to take this pledge, to step up, to keep consumers connected, even if the consumer wasn't able to pay a bill, I do think that helps. And so it was a combination of all three things: a public-private partnership, a sense of community, and market forces that enabled us to get through what was initially, at least, a pretty dire situation. I think now, of course, we've gotten used to these types of technology platforms, but in the early days, it was very unclear how anyone was going to be able to connect. And so I'm grateful that of the many difficulties that consumers have had over the last several months, connectivity, generally speaking, has been something that they could count on. And I think that's something that everybody should be proud of.
Yeah, you just think about, as bad as things are right now, like, what if this hit 5 years ago? Even the advances that we've made every year have mattered so much as far as connectivity.
Absolutely. To me, at least, telehealth is a great example of
Yep.
that. I mean, the University of Pittsburgh Children's Hospital got a grant from us, and one of the doctors there did a video where a child who recently got a transplant and was immunocompromised didn't have to come in again. And just one case, of course, doesn't make data, but I think it just shows the fact that technology has advanced to the point where we can do incredible things together, if we make a determination to make this technology ubiquitous. So telehealth's a good example. It's not the only one, but I too wonder, my God, if this happened 25 years ago, 50 years ago, it would have been a very different circumstance, no doubt about it.
Absolutely. Listen, the Sullivan family has used telehealth in certain programs a few times. I've got a 6-year-old. They fall out of trees, whatever it might be. I mean, we've used it. I'm sure many of our panelists or people that are watching right now have as well. But what exactly is the FCC's role in telehealth? Like, aside from making sure there's the bandwidth and the spectrum, what's your role there?
Well, so this has been one of my passions at the FCC. A couple of years ago, I did an op-ed with former President Kennedy's chairman, Newt Minow, about this very issue, because we think that telehealth is arguably the tip of the spear when it comes to broadband's importance. And so we have a lot of role here, a big role here, implementing the COVID-19 telehealth program, which, as I mentioned, Congress gave us authority to do earlier this year. Even before that, we had a rural healthcare program, which allocates millions of dollars hundreds of millions every year to healthcare providers. And we increased the budget for that under my leadership for the first time in a generation. In addition to that, we're also looking to support connected care wherever the patient is. Healthcare delivery is changing rapidly. It's no longer the case that you have to go into a bricks and mortar facility. We want to enable patients to be monitored wherever they happen to be, as opposed to where the provider is. And those wireless sensors and other connected tools, that's the FCC issue. The spectrum, the devices, the networks, all of that relies on wireless innovation. So we have a big role here, and it's going to increase, I think, in the time to come.
Yeah, where do you see it going? I mean, how big is this going to be, and how much influence will the FCC have?
I think we are going to have a pretty important seat at the table, but it's not going to be the only one. Over the last several months, I've had the chance to work with my counterparts at the Department of Health and Human Services, CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, the Department of Veterans Affairs, which of course operates a big healthcare facility, a number of healthcare facilities as well. All of us, I think, are working on the same page to make sure that as we emerge from the pandemic, some of the forward-thinking reforms we've adopted in a pinch because of the emergency can last beyond that. So some of it doesn't involve the FCC, reimbursement for telehealth on par with in-person care and the like. But I think that there's going to be a push to make telehealth more of the norm rather than the exception.
Yeah, okay. I'm gonna say something I'm sure you know, and I don't mean in any insultingly way, because the private sector does it too. The private sector, when something's hot, everybody wants a piece of it, whether it's investors or private equity, or everyone runs over to this side of the boat. The government is not innocent of that as well. Telehealth is, to your point, red hot. A lot of agencies, you just mentioned a few, might have some domain over it. How do we make sure that we don't screw it up?
That's a very good question. So at least for me, my goal is to make sure that to the maximum extent feasible, we can connect healthcare providers and patients, regardless of where they happen to be. And as long as that connectivity is there, I mean, I think that's what the FCC is really concerned about. Some of the other issues that are implied, reimbursement or making sure that consumers are protected in terms of personal information, that lies beyond the FCC's bailiwick, even though they're important, of course. But from my perspective, at least, I want some of the great healthcare providers I've had the chance to visit over the years, from the Cleveland Clinic to the Telemental Health Hub that the VA operates in Salt Lake City, to be able to treat anyone regardless of where they are. And that, I think, that is the future, no doubt about it.
Please do, because there's so many people suffering. I know depression, anxiety is up in some areas, suicides are up. Everybody who needs help should be able to get it, especially when you can't physically go out. It's such an important time. There's a lot of other things on the pandemic that we're not talking about as much, but let's move on. 5G. I've seen these Apple commercials. They want to sell me a new phone. Is it worth it? Is 5G going to be? I mean, it's been made out to be the secretariat of sort of technology. Horse racing reference, by the way, from '73. Is 5G going to be all that they're promising us?
Well, I'm sure they would prefer to say it's the American Pharaoh of horses, but anyway, regardless of what time. No, but that's a determination every consumer will have to make. But I think it's very exciting because it shows that America is leading the world in the development and deployment of 5G technologies. To see the phone come out and to see some of the networks being built, the spectrum being put to use. It's an exciting time for wireless innovation, and that's in part because the FCC has been very aggressively executing its 5G fast plan to promote American leadership in 5G, getting spectrum out there, enabling infrastructure to be built, enabling fiber to be deployed for carrying all that network traffic back into the core of the network. All of that has led to some of the innovation that we're seeing today.
And what's going to be the biggest challenge for 5G? Of course, listen, the ads, like download a movie quickly, listen to all your music with the blink of an eye. You don't need the physical cable. The last mile problem is solved. But as we know, the problems are not solved. We've got auction issues, we've got spectrum issues as well. What do you foresee for 5G from the provider side?
Well, I foresee the providers taking advantage of the building blocks that the FCC has put in place and starting to deliver unique services for consumers and businesses alike. We're still in the early stages. To switch to a different sport, I would say that we're probably at the end of the first inning, if that.
Wow.
So, I think there's still a lot of runway for companies to run with 5G. And for our part, at least, we've been extremely aggressive. I've mentioned the spectrum we put in the commercial marketplace. Over the last couple of years alone, we've held auctions in the 3.5, 24, 28, 37, 39, 47 gigahertz band. We have a big auction coming up on December 8th of the 3.7 band. Auctions coming up next year of the 2.5 and hopefully 3.4 to 5 bands. We put a lot of spectrum in the marketplace, and now we're seeing companies use some of that to light up networks. For example, one of the big providers has activated a 5G network that covers something like 200 million Americans. And so all of that work we did in the initial years is starting to pay off as companies take those building blocks and deliver services for consumers that some of which we can't even conceive today. It's hard to see where it's going to go, but it's just an exciting time for the American wireless consumer.
How do you think those auctions are going to go next year? I mean, what kind of money are we talking about? Any estimates?
Well, I've seen estimates all over the map. The 3.5 gigahertz auction we just finished recently this past summer raised $4.5 billion. And that was about 70 megahertz of spectrum. We have a 280 megahertz spectrum auction coming up on December 8th, which a lot of people have shown interest in. So I think it just speaks to the fact that there is a lot of demand for airwaves. And that's just on the license side, by the way. I mentioned earlier Wi-Fi. Under my administration, we've increased the amount of mid-band spectrum available for Wi-Fi by a factor of 5. So whether you're in your home or on the go, you'll be able to connect with that free spectrum to get gigabit Wi-Fi potentially.
Okay, we got about 15 minutes left, so I'm just going to kind of throw a bunch of stuff out there. We got some questions from people that are watching, that have watched or reached out to me privately. Should the FCC have any role in deciding what companies should be allowed to put on the internet? That's a question around the fairness doctrine.
Well, I've been very clear on that point. I don't think the FCC has a role in dictating what content gets put on the internet. So I would say no to that one.
What about the streaming wars? What is the FCC's role, if any, in the fight between Netflix and HBO Max and Peacock from us and everybody else?
We don't have a role there. I will simply say that as a consumer of video products and services, it's an incredible time. I mean, I grew up in a time, and you're obviously much younger than me, but I remember just 3 broadcast channels and, just switching the dial manually because we didn't have remote controls. And to go from that to now, where you watch what you want to watch, when you want to watch it, incredible breadth of content and much more deeper content. It's just an incredible time for the American video consumer. So our goal is to simply put these strong broadband networks in place so that consumers on whatever device are able to stream some of that great content.
I don't know how old you think. Listen, I get up in the 3 o'clock hour. My show's on at 5 a.m. I'm 49. I feel 116 years old some days. So I don't know how old you think I am, but I actually was, I think, the first county in America that had cable television, or one of them. I know we were the first to have MTV, Orange County, California. Here's a different issue is we're moving so much toward user-generated content, TikTok and others, right? Instagram, Reels. Does the FCC, or should the FCC have any role in that? Does the agency risk becoming less relevant as the content is literally just, people dancing and not scripted shows? And I'm looking at you, Quibi.
Well, under current law, the FCC does not have a role in that area. So I would have to defer to any other agencies that it might, but it is certainly not ours.
Okay. Is there anything that you are the most, listen, you might have heard this, an election coming up in about 10 days. Is there, you never know what changes that may bring. What are you most proud of or most frustrated by at your time at the FCC?
Oh boy, so it's hard to answer in a way because, of course, when you're in the middle of the sprint, it's difficult to stop and just take stock of, how far you've gone along the route. But I think one of the things I'm so proud of is our work to close the digital divide. I come from rural Kansas. I know people who have been on the wrong side of that divide and are still. And over the last 3 years, to visit 49 states and the territories of Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands and see that divide, the challenges and the opportunities it presents has been incredible. So I'd say that addressing that top challenge, our top priority, has been very, very important to me. Also, putting in place the steps for America to be able to lead the world in 5G has been incredibly important. Finally, I would say a lot of the consumer-facing steps, getting an increase in spectrum for Wi-Fi, making sure that we reform some of our policies to get technology more accessible to those with disabilities. Recently, we announced our decision to tap 988 as a 3-digit number for suicide and prevention and mental health, which is important to me. And finally, I mentioned a couple of months ago, an initiative to reduce the rates that the incarcerated have to pay and their loved ones on the outside have to pay for interstate and intrastate calls. And you're working with
why not make it free? It just seems that seems silly that people that are locked up can't just make a free call.
And that's what we've been working with our counterparts on the state and local level and some of the outside advocates to make sure that those people are able to connect, especially now when, of course, visitation is even more difficult because of the distancing protocols and the like. So across the board, all of these consumer-facing priorities have been really, really important to me, and I'm glad that we made progress on them. Haven't had a chance to talk about robocalls, of course, but that's one of them as well that I'm sure enrages you and many other consumers.
Why can't we buy? Okay, you brought it up. Why can't we figure this out? I mean, I don't know. Our panelists here probably get 5 to 10 a day. Where are they coming from? Why is this so hard to regulate?
So we have pulled out the stops over the last couple of years to stop this flood of robocalls, annoying and in some cases scamming consumers. So for example, we imposed a mandate on telephone companies that they have to implement a new caller ID authentication framework within a certain time. We also have imposed different regulations to encourage blocking of calls that are obviously illegal. In addition, during the pandemic, we noticed that there was an influx of coronavirus-related robocalls, and they were coming to certain so-called gateway providers, smaller companies in the US, that were then launching them onto the networks. And so in collaboration with the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice, we sent letters repeatedly to a number of these different companies. And within 24, 48 hours, those companies blocked those robocalls from going onto the network. So across the board, and enforcement action, of course, the largest fines in FCC history have been imposed on robocallers who've been annoying consumers. So I know there's still more work to do, but we are making progress.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that I don't know if this is your doing or Apple's or whatever, at least on my iPhone. I'm not touting Apple versus Samsung. They're all great companies, Android, whatever. Is I get a now message that says likely spam sometimes. Right. Is that you? Did you do that?
So we personally didn't develop the technology, but what we did was to empower phone companies to use analytics to determine whether or not a spam call, or whether or not a call was likely to be spam, and then to take steps such as that to alert consumers, this is likely a spam call, don't answer it. We've also been proactive, by the way, in reaching out to consumers directly with tips about certain scams that might pop up, the so-called One Ring scam that was big a few months ago, and letting them know that you don't answer the phone, don't give over your personal information. If something bad happens, here's how you file a complaint or get redress. So we're all here too. We're all in it together to make sure that when that phone rings, consumers have the peace of mind that they deserve.
Yeah, I keep trying to block my teenager that reports spam, but somehow she gets through. Dad, I need a ride, I need money, whatever it might be. I've heard about this Space Force. What are your thoughts on the need for a new tech agency? Do we need one? Should we have one?
Well, I think the FCC does a pretty darn good job in space, and the last 3 years have demonstrated that. We're in the middle of a new space age, and the FCC has been right there at the table, enabling some of that innovation and investment to happen on our shores. For example, under my leadership, the first ever low Earth orbit constellations have been authorized, and they're now launching, companies like SpaceX and OneWeb. We've also streamlined the process for some of the newer entrants, the so-called small satellites, so they don't have to jump through the same regulatory hoops and pay the same large fees that a big satellite company might have to do. So a lot of those small sats are now setting up shop here in the United States and creating good jobs. We've also made sure that we can ensure a safe environment in space by trying to update our orbital debris regulations for the first time since 2004. So our goal here is pretty simple. We want America to lead in space, just as we lead in terrestrial innovation, and that requires the FCC to be nimble. And that's exactly what we've done.
What about with the digital economy, the Amazons of the world? Again, and I know you're gonna answer. It's made you guys more relevant. Nobody's gonna say, well, we're less relevant than we used to be. So the digital economy, obviously, you view yourself and the FCC and the agency as an integral part of managing that. Where does the FCC come in on the money side? I'm gonna buy stuff online.
So we don't have a direct role in that. To the extent that there are any consumer protection issues or privacy issues, that would tend to be the purview of the Federal Trade Commission and any state consumer protection commission agencies. Not so much the FCC. We focus more on the networks, of course, that allow that kind of transaction to happen, not so much on the particulars of the commerce that traverses over those networks.
Yeah, because the idea being is that right now the U.S. is a global leader in digital, e-commerce. You've got Shopify from Canada as well. There's some global players. How do we make sure we don't lose our leadership in that competitive position?
Well, part of it involves making sure that we have broadband networks that are world-class, and I do think that we have very strong broadband networks. Part of it is also encouraging a culture of entrepreneurship and innovation here. And here it's very interesting because I've had conversations with some of my counterparts in other countries, and they are looking to replicate some of that same magic that we've had in the technology space. It's not an easy thing to do. You have to be able to encourage companies and entrepreneurs to raise capital, to hire smart people, to take the risks, and then when they fail, enable them to get back up on their feet and try again. And that's something America has historically done very well. And I love that picture of the old HP garage because from back in the 1940s, that's sort of the American story, even in the 21st century. And so we want to make sure, not as the FCC necessarily, but just generally as Americans, that America is always a place that is welcoming to those who want to roll the dice and want to create the next big thing, because that's ultimately the way that consumers in our country and people around the world are going to be able to benefit. And I would also note that there's something unique about our marriage of that culture with a culture of freedom and free expression and the like. So I think that that's part of what has made the American internet economy so special.
Yeah, and investment is so key, especially in the rural areas. I've driven across the Midwest a few times this summer. In fact, Monday or Sunday, I'm leaving for a 9-day, 8 or 9 state election road trip. I'm literally driving like all over the place by myself, social masked up. Don't worry, everybody. to talk about some of the key counties. And I'm going to be driving through a lot of rural areas. And I've done it. I've been shocked at how well the connection has been for me. I've done it a couple of times already this summer. Are you happy with the level of investment on the wireless side? There are still blank spots in America, not many. What could you do to encourage more?
Well, we certainly have made progress over the last couple of years, but there is still room to improve, no doubt about it. And I see that for myself when I fly back home and I fly into Kansas City, drive about 3 hours south to my hometown. You see the bars on your phone start to tick down, and eventually you see no service in many spots. And so, especially for things like public safety or telehealth, we want to make sure that that wireless connection is there. So we've done a lot. One part of it involves streamlining the wireless infrastructure rules so that you have a consistent level of regulation across the country. And those rules are some of which I just mentioned were upheld by the Ninth Circuit. Part of it, though, also involves making sure that the FCC, through its Universal Service Fund, is able to subsidize those parts of the country where no matter how much regulatory reform you do, there won't be a business case. And next week, my colleagues at the FCC will have a chance to vote on my plan for a 5G fund for rural America to target those parts of the country that are unlikely to see the next generation wireless connectivity without federal subsidies. As this new innovation happens, I don't want there to be some people who are left in the early 21st or even the 20th century when it comes to wireless. We want everyone to be able to rise together.
My guess is that Parsons, Kansas is not having a problem with broadband, is it? I mean, are they doing okay? Not that you're going to play favorites or anything.
Look, it's a challenge out there too. And we lived on a gravel road outside of town. And for a while, the only provider my parents could get was Wave Wireless, a great fixed wireless company. And they do great work too, but it's hard. I mean, Parsons is the biggest town in Labette County, and there are parts of Labette County that are much smaller than ours. So we want to make sure that everybody has a chance to have what I call digital opportunity. And that's not an easy thing to do, but it's an American thing to do because increasingly opportunity in this country depends on your access to technology.
Okay. The best provider was you when you got your driver's license. If it was like me, parents started saying, you know what, take this to town because they didn't want to go. And suddenly, you wanted to drive. My parents used me as like a UPS delivery guy most of the time. I'm going to wrap it up with this because, listen, there will be life outside of Washington, D.C. What do you want to do when you leave?
Oh, well, I haven't really given a lot of thought to that yet. I'm still, as I said, in the middle of the sprint. I've often joked that if the Kansas City Chiefs ever need a washed up 40, 70-year-old slot receiver, I'm their guy. I could probably do the job for him. But, I've joked about Judge Judy.
They don't need any help on offense.
That's probably true. Yeah, but I'm too slow
to play for the Jets. You could probably start today.
That's probably true. Just following the footsteps of Namath, Kenny O'Brien, Flip, and some of those other great players. But no, I haven't had a chance to think about that yet. And I'm still having just an incredibly involved time working with the FCC staff and all the great folks in this communication sector to deliver digital opportunity. So whenever it's time to make a decision, I'll make a decision, but that time isn't quite yet.
All right. Well, got one more question I want to ask before we leave here. Have you changed your position on the Chevron deference in order to facilitate a Section 230 rulemaking? I have no idea what that means, but you probably do.
Well, I have not, to my knowledge, taken a position on it. So the answer to the question is I have not changed the position.
There you go. Well, we're going to end it there, guys. It's been a real pleasure. Ajit Pai, thank you very much for joining us here with the TPI. I think the conversation was wide-ranging, interesting, dare I say, even a little fun for a policy It's hard to believe, I know, but you do so well, and we appreciate it. And good luck to you and your agency, and everybody be well and be safe. And thank you, Ajit.
Hey,
appreciate it.
Thanks so much. From the Secretary to the Jets, we covered a lot of ground, but really appreciate the conversation.
We certainly did. And thanks to Scott Walston and everybody at TPI for having me as well. Thank you, everybody. I know the conference is going to go on. I am going to sign off. Commissioner Pai, take care. Best to you and yours, everybody. And have a great rest of your conference. Take care, everyone.
You too. See you later.